4 keys to the amendment to address concerns in the Georgia Association of Realtors, or GAR, contract package. Hi, everybody. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta, and today's contract video tip has to do with the amendment to address concerns. This is the 2025 edition. This amendment does undergo changes periodically, and today's video is, we are in May of 2025, and I just want to cover 4 important things that you may not be aware of regarding the amendment to address concerns. So let me share my screen and we'll dive in. This is the Georgia Association of Realtors, or GAR, Form F704, Amendment to Address Concerns with the Property. This is an amendment to use between a buyer and a seller after you are binding. Obviously, it's an amendment, so you have a binding contract, and the contract is subject to a due diligence period. We know during the due diligence period, that is a buyer option to terminate the contract for any or no reason. Well, during this time frame, there is incentive. A seller has an incentive to keep that buyer in contract. The seller doesn't want the buyer to terminate. They chose that offer. They chose to go binding with that buyer. So the seller has every incentive to keep the buyer under contract. So a buyer, in choosing to make a decision whether to stay under contract and go through with the purchase of this property or terminate and go find another property, there are some issues that they would propose that the seller address with the property to help them make the decision to stay in contract or terminate. That's the use of this amendment. So again, this is the 2025 printing. This is the version that did come out in January of 2025. We do not have mid-year revisions yet. I am recording this in May. So I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but I do have a couple of paragraphs highlighted, and I have my notes that you all seem to love. So I appreciate that. Comment below if you like my notes on my handouts. So the first paragraph, I will go ahead and read that to you. This says, this amendment is intended to set forth the agreement of the parties relative to concerns raised by the buyer during the due diligence period. This is the key thing. This is point number 1. If this amendment does not become effective during the due diligence period, it shall become null and void and of no legal force and effect. Okay, Dana, what does that mean? That means that if it is not signed by both buyer and seller, that's what it means to not become effective. To become effective, it has to be signed by buyer and seller with notice of acceptance given to the last party that made the offer. So if it is not signed by both buyer and seller prior to the end of the buyer's due diligence period, then it is not part of the contract. It is null and void and of no legal effect. So if a buyer and a seller are negotiate items for the seller to address with the property, if the buyer, I'll get to that in a minute. That's my next section, but I'll come back to that. Point number 2, an open amendment to address concerns that a buyer sends a seller or a seller sends as a counter amendment back to a buyer does not extend the due diligence period. That due diligence period is a drop-dead time frame for a buyer to choose to terminate the contract and get their earnest money back, terminate and send notice of termination to the seller and get their earnest money back, or go through with the contract. unless the parties via amendment with signatures choose to extend the due diligence period. Just because a buyer and a seller are negotiating on these terms, let's say a buyer sends an amendment to a seller and they ask the seller to do A, B, C, D. And the seller sends a counter amendment back saying, I'll do A and B, but not C and D. And then the buyer sends a counter amendment back saying, I really need A and B done. You're getting close to the end of that due diligence time frame. If you buyer agents, if you do not have this back signed from the seller, regardless of your email or phone communication with the agent, if it is not fully executed, signed with notice before the end of the buyer's due diligence period, then the buyer has just purchased that property as is. So again, number 2, an open amendment to address concerns a buyer sends to a seller does, or vice versa, does not extend the buyer's due diligence period, i.e., termination rights with protection of earnest money. Now, remember, there is another part to this. Well, before I go on, let me say this. If a buyer and a seller are negotiating through items that a seller, the buyer wants the seller to address with the property, and they're negotiating back and forth. Like I said, buyer says A, B, C, D. Seller says, I'll do A and B, not C and D. Buyer says, I really want A and D. Buyer has no intention of terminating. They want the property. It would just be nice if the seller would pay for these issues, address these issues. So you do not have this fully executed amendment. Due diligence period ends. Buyer fails to terminate. There's no more incentive for a seller to agree to that. However, if a seller does choose to address these issues and this amendment was not fully agreed upon and binding before the end of due diligence period, this is back up to my note here. Any terms acceptable to the parties after the end of due diligence, those terms need to be agreed to and signed on a general amendment, or GAR F701, Amendment to Agreement. This document, if you don't have it signed by buyer and seller before the end of due diligence period, it is not part of the contract. It's not enforceable, and it says it is null and void. All right. Number 3, again, there is some built-in incentive in this form. In this paragraph, the buyer and the seller have the option, and it's initiated by the buyer. So it says, in consideration of the seller agreeing to address these concerns, all parties agreed that if this amendment is signed by the buyer and seller and delivered to both parties, the remainder of the buyer's due diligence period shall or shall not terminate. What is that all about? Well, that's my point number 3. The buyer may incentivize the seller to accept this amendment by terminating their due diligence period early. Let's say they go under contract and they have a 10-day due diligence period. Let's say they get an inspection done or whatever, and we are 4 days from binding agreement date. Buyer sends this to the seller. And if the buyer opts to terminate the due diligence period, then the buyer's right to terminate for any or no reason and get their earnest money back would terminate with the fully executed amendment rather than the negotiated due diligence period on the purchase and sale agreement. So again, the buyer may incentivize the seller to go ahead and accept this amendment by terminating the due diligence period early, or vice versa, a seller using this as a counter amendment may use this option to terminate, that they would agree to this if it terminates the buyer's due diligence period with acceptance. And then point number 4. If a buyer, if their requested concern with the property is what I always reference as a make it or break it issue for the buyer. For example, if the seller will not address this concern, the buyer just cannot go through with this purchase. Needs a new roof, needs a structural foundation propping up, or something that is just too cost prohibitive for a buyer, or a buyer chooses to not take on. If it is a make it or break it issue, then and you're negotiating back and forth with the seller, you buyer's agents protect the buyer's earnest money with GAR Special Stipulation 302. And what that states, I have it written here for you as a note, make it a little bit bigger. In the event that a subsequent amendment to address concerns with the property is not accepted by the seller and delivered back to the buyer prior to the end of the buyer's right to terminate as set forth in due diligence provision of the agreement, then said amendment to address concerns with the property shall serve as notice of termination of this agreement upon expiration of the right to terminate period set forth herein. Okay, what does all of that mean? Again, if it is a make it or break it issue, and the buyer absolutely cannot go through with this purchase if the seller does not address this specific concern or whatever you have on this amendment, then what that special stipulation means, if the seller does not agree to perform that item with their agreement written, signed on this amendment sent back to the buyer prior to the end of due diligence period, then this is their notice of termination and their earnest money will be protected. You would still have to do a TNR to request the disbursement of the earnest money. But again, a termination is unilateral by notice. This document, when the buyer sends it, is signed by the buyer. So it would act as a unilateral termination of the contract. Again, if the seller doesn't sign it, agreeing to address that item, send it back to the buyer before the end of due diligence, then this does terminate the contract on behalf of the buyer. Why would you do that? Again, only use this step if it is something big and the buyer absolutely must terminate. If it's like a reverse polarity in a GFCI outlet or some rotten wood that needs to be replaced and repainted or something, the buyer probably does not want to terminate the contract. So again, only use this amendment if it is a make it or break it issue. Discuss this with the buyer. So these are the 4 points. I will link this document with my notes in the description below. Please comment on your experience with the amendment to address concerns and anything else you'd like me to do videos on. Thank you so much for watching. I do hope this contract tip helped you out. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Bye. If you like that video, check out the one here. If you like the content on this entire channel, please click here to subscribe. I try to take even the most complicated of real estate situations and make them crystal clear. See what I did there? Real estate made crystal clear. Thank you guys so much for watching.